the Canadian government has just dropped a massive new strategy called a force of nature. The goal? To stop and even reverse the loss of biodiversity. We're talking about a nearly $4 billion investment, making it one of the boldest conservation plans in the country's history. But it's also a plan that's right at a crossroads, kicking off a huge debate about the future of Canada's environment and its economy.
To really get your head around the scale of what they're trying to do, just think about this question. The goal is to protect an additional 1.6 million square kilometers of land. That's an area 1.7 times the size of British Columbia. It's a massive, continental-sized challenge that really gets to the heart of what Canada is all about. And there's the number that's got everyone talking. The federal government is putting up over $3.8 billion to try and make this happen. This cash is meant for everything from creating new national parks to funding some really innovative partnerships. And it's all part of a high-stakes race against a 2030 deadline.
Okay, so what is this all about? At its core, the strategy is all about meeting a global commitment that you might have heard of, 30 by 30. It's a target that came out of the big Kunming-Montreal Biodiversity Conference, where nations basically promised to protect 30% of their land and oceans by the end of the decade. For a country as huge as Canada, that is a monumental task. And this chart really shows you the challenge in a nutshell. Right now, Canada protects about 14% of its land and around 15.5% of its oceans. To get to that 30% target by 2030, well, that means we have to more than double the protected land area in just a handful of years. The big question is, how on earth do you do that? Well, to close that gap, the government has a pretty detailed plan, but that plan comes with some really big promises and, according to its critics, some very serious problems. So let's break down the core of this strategy and get into the controversies that are bubbling up around it. The whole strategy really stands on three main pillars. First one is simple: protect more nature with parks and other conservation areas. The second one, Building Canada Well, is all about trying to mix economic development with conservation. And the third is about finding new ways to put a value on nature and fund it, partly by getting private investors interested. And this brings us to a major point of tension. The government is saying, hey, we can use AI to map out biodiversity, which will actually speed up the permitting process for development projects. But critics like the Wilderness Committee are saying, hang on a second. They argue this whole approach just fits conservation around what industry wants. It's a really fundamental disagreement. Should we reshape conservation to fit industry, or should nature always come first? Now, a huge piece of this puzzle, a full 8% of that 30% land target, is this tool called an OECM. So what is that? Well, these are areas that aren't your typical parks, but they're managed in a way that's good for biodiversity. You can think of them as a flexible, but also pretty controversial, way to reach the goal. And you can see why people are concerned when you look at what can actually qualify as an OECM. We're talking about a military training base in Manitoba, a natural cemetery, even working areas where industrial stuff like logging is still allowed. This is what has environmental groups worried about so-called paper protections, things that look good on a spreadsheet but don't deliver real on-the-ground conservation. Okay, now, there is no part of this strategy more important than the role of Indigenous peoples. Their leadership is basically the linchpin of the whole plan. It's this blend of reconciliation and conservation that also happens to raise some big questions for Canada's resource economy. And the government itself makes this crystal clear. This quote isn't just nice-sounding words. It's the reality of how this plan has to work. The strategy says flat out that its success completely depends on partnership with First Nations, Inuit, and the Métis Nation, who have been stewards of these lands for thousands of years. And the money really follows that principle. Out of that total $3.8 billion, a massive $1.63 billion is specifically for Indigenous stewardship. And a key part of that, over $230 million, goes to Indigenous Guardians Programs, which actually empower communities to monitor and protect their own traditional territories. So here you have two totally competing ways of looking at this. The government sees this partnership as a win-win. It's good for reconciliation and good for the environment. But for industries like mining and forestry, this idea of co-management with Indigenous governments brings a whole new layer of economic uncertainty. They're worried about what they call the de facto sterilization of land, where it becomes almost impossible to access for development. But even with this central role, some Indigenous groups are also critical.
In an annex to the strategy document, the Assembly of First Nations warns that the plan's focus on things like ecosystem services still risks framing nature as just another resource to be extracted. They argue it continues a colonial worldview instead of truly changing it.
So, beyond Indigenous partnerships, the strategy runs straight into another classic Canadian problem: that deep, historic divide between the federal government and the provinces over who actually controls the land and its resources. This is not a new fight, believe me.
And this chart gets right to the heart of the issue. Look at this. The federal government owns only 6% of Canada's land. The vast majority, 76%, is controlled by the provinces and territories. So Ottawa can set a big national target, but it absolutely cannot achieve it without the provinces buying in.
And this tension feeds a really powerful political story. Opponents frame this 30 by 30 goal not as a Canadian priority, but as some arbitrary UN-style global commitment that's totally out of touch with Canadian economic realities, like resource jobs and the cost of living. And here it is, the main critique from the official opposition. They're framing this $3.8 billion not as a crucial investment, but as fuel for a new bureaucracy that's just going to waste money and not get results, pointing to missed environmental targets from the past. So all of this brings us back to the core dilemma, doesn't it? This plan is forcing a national conversation about how we balance Canada's economic engines with the urgent need to protect our natural heritage. And the stakes for both could not be higher. So it really all comes down to this fundamental trade-off. On one side, you have the incredible promise of halting biodiversity loss, advancing reconciliation, and unlocking trillions of dollars in what they call ecosystem services. But on the other side, you have some very real risks: the huge financial cost, new limits on key industries, political infighting, and the fear that maybe these protections won't even work. Ultimately, this strategy leaves Canada with a profound question. Is this a plan for conservation, or is it a constraint on our prosperity? This $3.8 billion plan is a bet that Canada can, in fact, have both. But whether that bet actually pays off, well, that's a story that's still being written.